Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neat, Plausible and Wrong, a show where we look at business psychology through the lens of neurodiversity. I'm Matthew, and as ever, I'm talking with Dr. Miriam.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, and today's topic, we're going to be talking about personality types. And this is, I think this is one of those things where we were, when we first thought up the idea of the show, was one of the things that we really wanted to look at and kind of gave us the idea in the first place. So I'm really looking forward to this one and kind of digging into it a bit more. But where do you start with on personality types?
I think my thoughts around personality type, it goes way back to look at what exactly are they? How did they come about? And when were they devised? I know it was at different times, but how much did we know at the time about neurodivergence? And who was the population or the sample that was used? What was the population like?
Yeah, I think I kind of feel similarly, really. They're incredibly powerful things culturally. It feels like there's something about personality types that really resonates with people and leads to them being used in ways that maybe are a bit of an over application of some of the ideas that they have that don't feel like where they originally came from necessarily.
Yeah. And I guess from what you are saying, some of those were developed for career development, interpersonal relationship, self-awareness, or psychological purposes. But people are now almost using them for different things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so when we say personality types, what are we actually talking about as a kind of general class of things? What are these things?
Yeah, so I think what we are looking at are theories, which are frameworks designed to categorize and explain how people think, feel, and behave in different situations.
So they're primarily about, I suppose it's like dispositional is sometimes the word I hear described. It's a bit of a jargon word, but it's like how are we disposed? How are we likely to respond to things in certain circumstances? And the goal of them is to figure out how different people respond in different ways.
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're thinking about, and assuming that those, that's going to be a relatively consistent thing, and that we can be assigned a certain type, and people who belong to a certain type, or perhaps who have a high level of certain traits, which are less boxes and more kind of scales. But people who are assigned to a certain type or have a certain trait to a high level are going to behave in a certain way, and people who have a different one are going to behave in a different way. That's broadly what we're saying when we're saying personality type, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think another thing to add to that is what their preference is in terms of how they are going to be behaving. But I don't know that in that we are considering what influences one's preference or ways of behaving or thinking or even feeling.
Yes, I guess they do imply a model about how much what is represented as personality actually does influence and in what circumstances as well. So there's definitely something, there's quite a lot of things going on there. But in terms of specific ones I've come across and explored a little bit, at least, are the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs, which is a big one. I think most people will have heard of and used. I've also come across Enneagram, DISC, Clifton Strengths Finder, the Big Five, which is a trait-based rather than type-based personality model, and 16PF, the 16 personality factors as well. So I think, have you any of those familiar to you, and are there other ones that you've come across as well?
Yeah, they are all familiar to me. And I think in addition to that, I will add Hexaco, which is a maybe revision of Big Five personality traits.
Absolutely. And so how have you seen these used? How have you used them, or have you seen them used? How are they showing up?
So a lot of the times when I've seen them being used, it would be in situations where perhaps people want to understand how team dynamics might work, or when they are looking to hire somebody new, They look at where there might be some gaps or some holes which they would wish to fill up, and what kind of person they would be a good person to fill that up. Or when people apply for certain jobs, they would use some of these to assess what kind of personality the person have, as if this will determine their success or their ability to commit or be competent in particular roles. I've
So,
also, yeah.
So you've often seen them used in a kind of evaluative way, really,
Yes.
and people, assessing people's appropriateness for a certain or likely success in a certain context, a certain team, or a certain job role, those kind of things.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes I've also seen them being used to help somebody develop more self-awareness into what areas they may need to improve in. Although, yes, some of them might also look at what the person's strengths are, or what they might continue to firm up on.
Yeah, I've seen them used quite personally, quite often as a tool for self-development and self-awareness. Yeah, that feels like quite common in leadership training, understanding why you lead and how you lead, and your preferences or I think the implication of that is quite often where your blind spots are as well.
Yeah.
Because that's very often the way that these things are framed, whether or not that's fully true is this question we might get into a bit later. But I think that idea of where are your preferences? So where might you want to go? What situations might you enjoy, thrive in, want to develop, and what might you want to avoid as well? And also, I think I've seen these things used in more explanatory things as well, for understanding situations that have happened and looking at where things have either gone right or gone wrong. So that's the other big area that I've seen. But broadly, so what we're broadly saying is these things are used to, they're being used to understand where people fit into organizations and to find what is, in an ideal world, the best fit for those people.
Yeah.
That's the model that we're looking at, isn't it?
Yeah. And what you're saying makes a lot of sense, especially when you also look at when they are looking at these theories or these personality types, they are looking to position people in spaces where they think this is the best space for the person, or the person is more likely to do much better if they were in this role. So I think the intent is good, but I don't know how helpful the way things are done is, or how helpful the particular theories that are being used is.
Well, let's move on then to where there are flaws here, or where there are assumptions that perhaps aren't true. Because I feel like, I agree. There's good intent behind the use of these, I think, mostly, though I have seen them used as a mechanism for discrimination, and perhaps more intentionally. We'll talk about how they can be unintentionally a mechanism for discrimination, but they can also, I have seen them used as a way of really reducing employee headcount, just as a way of easily selecting people in a pseudo-scientific way, and claiming that it's rational and it's fair because of these tools. But in general, I agree that they're used with a hope that it's going to be good for the individual and it's going to be good for the organization.
Yeah, I quite like how you made the distinction of how sometimes they have been used to justify how a person might not be the right person for a particular role, and maybe to narrow down who is where. And I think this is where some of these conclusions that are derived from the theories may not hold as much weight as they are given.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so let's get into where these assumptions, where these theories come from a bit. And when we're looking at personality types, we're assuming really that personality is a stable thing.
Mm.
We're assuming that we all have an in kind of this ongoing, consistent disposition, preference that's going to override quite a lot of other things enough to show up in a busy, noisy, kind of complicated environment. And then that's going to guide a lot of our decision making and a lot of our behavior and a lot of our experiences. And also that those things are going to cluster together in certain ways. So we're going to, because a lot of the type-based ones in particular are very much like, okay, if you like this, you're also going to like that, and you're not going to like this third thing. So they're making quite strong assumptions about how our preferences all align and line up, and whether they really, how true that is, I think, is a really difficult question. And this is where neurodiversity in particular, being neurodivergent, can really make a lot of these feel not really as accurate as perhaps I think they're hoped to be.
Yeah. And I guess from what you are saying, you sound like you are talking about how maybe for neurotypicals, there may be more value in what is being said. But when you go to neurodivergent individuals, the oversimplification doesn't take into account how rigid some of these categories might appear and how much they fail to capture the nuances of neurodivergence.
I think, as you said, these models are built on data from a certain population.
Yeah.
And how robust that is, like how representative was that population of the people that we're applying these things to now?
Yeah.
And there's both, the normal kind of demographic stuff. There's stuff, and as you said, a lot of these were constructed quite a long time ago when people were fundamentally kind of different. There are certain things where our expectations about personality, which is such a complex, multifaceted thing, have changed quite profoundly across generations. So there's a whole bunch of different things going on into how we're constructing these ideas and whether they really are fixed and whether we really can, and I think to a point it's possible, if you have a representative sample of people, to then say there's a reasonably high probability that someone else who has a lot of these traits is going to be similar in some of these ways. And that doesn't seem like too much of a leap to me, though I think we always have to think of it as a partial. It can't be an absolute truth.
Yeah.
But the other side of it is the further away you get from that reference person that was used to construct this data, the weaker that's going to be and the less predictive that's going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Totally. And I think from what you are saying as well, whilst these models or theories were done a long time ago, before we knew much about neurodivergence, which we are beginning to know a lot about, then there is perhaps need to revisit, review, and come up with something better that serves more than just one group, that looks at what the weaknesses or the flaws might be because of the sample that was used or the sample that was not included.
And I think this reflects, I've seen quite a lot of personality types where certain neurodivergent conditions are much more likely to type in some specific ways than others, which is an interesting challenge, is to a thing, is personality. And what do we mean, when personality is that related to a neurodivergent condition, is there's got to be some questions there around what do we actually mean by personality here, and how is it relating to other aspects of experience. And I would expect it to show up in other ways as well, and cultural things, and cross-culturally these things don't always work as well. That's another big thing, is that they're making quite strong assumptions about how people behave in, certainly with all the ones that I've listed, they're based in this, what sometimes in psychology research gets called weird. And it's an acronym. So this weird acronym of Western educated, industrialized, and I've forgotten the other ones. But that we do all of our research on quite narrow groups of people, and they don't apply well culturally either. So I think there's a lot of very, very strong assumptions going on in these things without a huge amount of depth and a huge amount of evidence that take into account how variable actual humanity is.
Mm-hmm. And when you talked about the cultural bias, yes, I was also thinking about that in terms of how most of these theories are developed in Western contexts and how they may not apply universally. And I am a typical example of somebody that has seen how a lot of these theories fail to apply universally. You also talked about the, maybe without using those words, lack of scientific rigor. And I think that also makes a lot of sense. I was also thinking about how a lot of these theories depend or rely on self-perception, which can also depend on a lot of what's going on for the person. What are they experiencing, or in what emotional, psychological space are they? So that will influence how they are going to self-perceive or self-score.
Yeah, and I've noticed this a couple of ways. First of all, that what questions mean. I often find the questions quite vague.
Yeah.
And I kind of know what judgment they're making underneath, but so much of that is contextual for me. It depends on a whole load of other things. I don't have a fixed preference one way or another. It's all so you end up kind of having to choose something to just to come up with an answer for the question.
Yeah.
And I think that the extent to which that language is really, how much can we represent our own lived experience? And because sometimes they actually use more comparative language as well. So it's like, I feel this more than others, or I feel this less than others. It's like, that's an incredibly hard question to answer accurately. And, one of the things I've noticed quite often in working with neurodivergent people is we quite often have specific sensitivities to certain things that mean we're really acutely aware when something isn't quite right. And what happens then is that we often tend to think we're not very good at those things, because we're so aware of what we're doing and making mistakes. But actually, if you look at the general population, we're really good, but we're also really critical. And those two things are kind of related. We're very self-critical. And so when we are asking people to evaluate, if people are highly self-critical in an area, we're also going to get a very distorted image. Or if people are very unself-critical in the other direction and think they're great at something when they're not.
Yeah, the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah. And what you are saying also reminds me of how these kind of self-reports and self-perceptions lack in biomarkers. So if you are saying you think you feel this more than other people, how many units more? And how do you know what other people feel? They may feel perhaps even worse, but they don't show it. They've got a way of maybe masking. I call it chameleonizing, because it's doing it in many different ways. And for people that are neurodivergent, when they are self-scoring, are they self-scoring on what they think other people want them to self-score, or what they have learned as a result of knowing how they are perceived by other people? The masking, the assimilation, the compensation. So when they are scoring, which bit of themselves are they actually scoring there?
Yeah, I think masking is a real issue, and we do implicitly learn how we're supposed to be and how we're not supposed to be.
Yeah.
For those of us who are neurodivergent, we often learn that we have very narrow spaces where we are acceptable and where we're actually allowed to do whatever it is that we want to do, or not at all, in fact. And so that can be, I think you're right, that ability to represent ourselves. Are we talking about the kind of public representation of ourselves rather than something that's actually reflecting our inner lived experience is definitely a thing. And I think the way that a lot of these things are framed and used and set up can also lead to that. If you know this is evaluating your job performance and your likely role, that's going to have an effect. Whether it does consciously or not is different, but it's definitely going to have an effect on the answers that you give.
Yeah, exactly.
So given all of this quite significant criticism, what can we still take from these, if anything? What can we still use from personality tools?
Yeah, I think in terms of self-awareness and growth, some of these models help individuals to understand themselves better and their motivations. And for career and team building, I think sometimes some of these are quite good in improving workplace collaboration, leadership, and communication within teams. Some of them also may help people navigate interpersonal relationships and the relationships perhaps with themselves. And when we look at research, perhaps some models have strong empirical support, and perhaps these sort of models have got a lot to give. However, again, as we identified earlier, the era in which they were done is different to the era now. So they do have some strengths.
I think that
yeah.
self-reflection and opening up conversation seems to be the useful where they are useful. I think I've seen similar, really, as it's a starting point. I think that's the really important thing, though.
Yeah.
Is if we're going to use them, it should be a starting point, not an end.
Indeed.
And the danger with types is that you can get stuck in a type. They can become self-fulfilling prophecies. You can kind of almost get stuck in the identity of a certain type. And I think this can be a particular problem with things like the Myers-Briggs, because it's partly because the things that underlie the Myers-Briggs are so attractive on a narrative level, because they're based in Jung's work that came from that world in the first place. So they have a kind of an energy to them that feels quite easy to get stuck in.
Yeah. And I think from what you're saying, I also get the sense that when you identify yourself as one particular type and something happens that pushes you out of that, when you already are predisposed to self-criticism, you criticize yourself for not presenting in the exact way that that particular model says people like that behave. Rather than realizing that this is not your shortfall, but a shortfall of the model.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you're right. That predictive stuff, there's a real risk there around kind of typing people together and people getting stuck. And I think this reflects, I think we should approach these with extreme care if we're assuming that there's any predictive value in them at all. Because we know from research that even the really robust ones do have some measurable predictive value, but it's so weak in terms of its predictive power, it can be overwhelmed by tons and tons of other things. So, for example, from all the research I could know everything about your personality in order to predict your behavior, but what would tell me far more about your likely behavior was whether you were hungry or not. And that would override absolutely everything about any personality type. So many of these things are contextual, or whether you'd had a good day already, or whether you'd had an argument with someone. All of these different things override these things so much that they can focus a lot on the individual, I think, and they can blind us to how important the context is,
Yeah.
particularly in an organization, even notwithstanding the fact that they might not be very accurate at judging all of that aspects of self as well. So I think we should probably, I go as strongly as to say we should avoid using these predictively. They can be tools to start off examination and exploration and self-reflection or group reflection, but they should never be used predictively to say, yes, this person is a good fit and this person isn't a good fit.
Predictively and conclusively. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. There is a blurry line there as well. We can have, but to start off those conversations, again, maybe they're okay, but they should always be that starting point, I think, for me.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So
they give that value, yeah.
Yeah. And if we are what might we do instead? So if we say we've been using personality types or we wanted to use personality types, what alternatives are there out there? How would we go forward from here?
I think, and this is something I think about very strongly, we have got to incorporate neurodivergent perspectives to ensure that personality assessments account for differences in cognition, in sensory processing, in communication styles. And what this means is we are moving towards the continuum-based models instead of fixed categories, using maybe trait-based, spectrum-based, and combine rather than just one particular one and leave it there. I also think that what you mentioned about cultural bias, this is something that will help to adapt the assessments to different cultural and social contexts, because contextual variability makes a lot of change, because it might cause somebody's ways of preferring something to shift depending on that.
It feels almost like this is the thinking about neurodiversity and applying the concept of, like, if you can make personality types work reliably for neurodivergent people, then you can make something that's likely to work for an awful lot more of the population. And the same goes with different cultures as well. So it feels like there's actually a challenge there, but maybe a positive one, for personality typing to really test itself against the broader range of humanity and look at where it works and where it doesn't work, and look at ways that it can be improved to reflect that, instead of really working in the opposite direction at the moment, which is the way it feels sometimes. I think for me, there's also this shift towards understanding environment, understanding being really clear about the role of environment, design, the systems around us, the situations in which we are in, and how important those are, and looking at those and shifting away from this idea that everything is within the complete control of and the complete responsibility of the individual, because I just don't think that doesn't reflect reality. And it also quite often reflects quite unequal power relations. It's like, if the organization is a bad place to work, it's not fair to put all the responsibility of addressing that onto frontline staff or people at lower levels in the organization. That's got to be something that's fixed systemically. And I think the other side of this for me is a shift to a more nuanced view, as similar to you, really, of greater understanding of us as individuals and all of our experiences and how those all contribute. I think for me, from a personality type perspective, what I would love to see, but which is very unlikely to happen because so many of these models are proprietary and kind of hidden models, is I would love to see them cross-evaluated. I would love to see how they work with each other. How, if someone is an Enneagram 2, how many people from being Enneagram 2 show up as a INFP in the Myers-Briggs, or yellow in the disc. I think that's the. I'm just so I forget some of these as well. So like all of these different categories, like how do they relate to each other? And then we could actually start to look at how they relate to experience, and also to other factors, like, do people from certain cultures show up differently? Do people with certain neurodivergent conditions show up differently? And really start to evaluate them. So I think if we do want to continue using them, it's about opening them up, both internally as ideas and externally in terms of how we're using and implementing them.
Yeah. I think part of me was also thinking in a way that maybe is not going to happen, or maybe it could happen, who knows. But I was thinking, if there were neurodivergent specific scales to use in addition to the scales that are already there, then the assessments and the theories could go a bit of a further way when we are looking at maybe sensory sensitivities, monotropism, executive function variability. So scales to include all that. And also, instead of just using the person rating themselves, complement other data from other areas. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a really interesting one, bringing in the kind of dimensions of difference that neurodivergent people experience. That would be a really, really fascinating way of doing it, for sure. Definitely.
Yeah. Maybe that's something we need to think more about doing, you and I, Matthew.
Maybe we'll see what emerges. Well, that's the whole thing. So super. Is there anything you'd like to kind of wrap up with? How are you leaving your feelings about personality types after this conversation?
I think in my head, because when I've had to complete any of them, I have said it depends. Where I would like to leave this is, who do they serve? Do they really work? Which parts of them don't work? So if they've got so many parts that don't work, how can we trust them? How much can we trust them?
There's a lot of space for stuff to go wrong in that. It depends, isn't there?
Yeah, because then if it was in this situation, feeling this way, not having slept, not having eaten much, and this having happened in my world, then it will be like this. But what if it was a different mix of things? The permutations are unmeasurable. And yet you've got to give only one response.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the more subtlety we can get, the more nuance we can build into things, the better. We don't want to be in a situation where we're reducing nuance at this point. I think that's the key thing this is really highlighted for me, is it can be simple is useful, but too simple is very dangerous indeed.
Yeah, it is. It's reductive, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, okay, super. Well, amazing. If you in the audience have any questions or anything, or any kind of comments or reflections, then please do let us know, and we'll answer any questions or anything in future episodes as well. And our next episode, we're going to be taking on visual thinking, which is quite an interesting one for me, because it's an idea I have some very mixed feelings about. So I'm looking forward to doing that. But yeah, I hope to see you all again soon. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.